Have you ever noticed how the Bible is so very practical? It seems page after page there's things for us to read, enjoy, and then practice. Many times we seem to be desperate to find the will of God for our lives, and we make it some nebulous thing, when many times the will of God is lived out in day-to-day practical terms. God is many times found in the mundane, in the everyday practices of life. In fact, Paul talks about that in Romans 12. He says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, or because of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So many times what do we do? How do I worship God better? What can I do? I need to have this ministry, or I need to do that, or it just seems like I'm doing nothing. And yet God would say to us, take your everyday life, your body, make that your living sacrifice. You put that on the altar. You give that to me, and that is very pleasing to God. And he says flat out, it's your spiritual act of worship. It's the giving of yourselves, your lifestyle, your worldview, your behavior. He says, don't conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that word for conform is very interesting. I think J.B. Phillips translated that, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. And that's very important. The world, the friends we have, the people that want to influence us would try to make us behave in certain ways. They influence us all the time. We're bombarded. And we're not to let that squeeze us into its mold. That's not to shape us. The Lord is. But that word conform was actually a word that meant to masquerade, to put on a mask. And what Paul is saying here is, look, you were a certain way before you found Christ. Before you became a Christian, you behaved in a certain way. Perhaps you had a bad temper. Perhaps you would be angry all the time. Perhaps you did this, you did that. And he's saying, look, now that you're born again, don't put on that old mask of anger. Don't put on that old mask of temper, but rather realize that you're not that person anymore. So as a believer, if you're having fits of anger, that's a mask. Take it off. You do not have to be like that any longer. So he says, don't conform to the world. Don't go back that way. But we are to be, and this is a continuous tense, we are to be being transformed. How? By the renewing of our mind. And that's an interesting term. Mind, it's nous. N-O-U-S, in the Greek nous. And the ancients in philosophy called the nous, the mind, the ability to see a camouflaged soldier among the rocks or the trees. And so what that is telling us is that this mind we have allows us to see things. And Paul says that we as believers now have the mind of Christ. So therefore, with that mind of Christ, being renewed and transformed, we can now see God. In fact, he emphasizes that in the next verse. He says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So you want to know what God wants you to do. You want to know how to behave. Then we need to put aside those things, those behaviors that we used to have. Don't put on that mask anymore. And be in the act of being transformed by this new mind that Christ has given us, this mind that now sees God, this mind that sees the way we should behave, this mind that understands via the Scriptures what God wants us to do. It takes some effort on our part, but we're up for it. You're up for it. You get the Scriptures out today. You pore over them. You pray about it. You say, God, what do you want me to do? How should I behave? It's in there. You'll find it. We'll try to bring you as much as we can daily in these meditations. You can tell others about it. You can share them. And we'll be more than happy to try to teach as we go along. But you pray about it. Take off that mask. Be transformed today.